My name is Jeff Davies, and I'm the owner-operator of Cybernautic Studios here in Mesa, Arizona. In this video, I want to introduce you to Blender. Now, this tutorial is really meant for iClone users and so forth, but you're going to find that iClone doesn't do everything you need when it comes to creating the final output. So I'm going to talk about how you can use Blender. Blender is a free 3D modeling software that covers many different disciplines in the 3D pipeline. It is extremely powerful, and as a direct result, comes with a large learning curve. I made at least 4 attempts to learn Blender before I finally committed to learning it. Because I wanted to learn all aspects of Blender, modeling, texturing, shading, scripting, video effects, and so on, it took me about 2 years before I was generally able to create what I wanted using Blender. Even now, there are features in Blender that I never use or touch. In this video, I'll give you some tips on how to make the most of your time with Blender so you can be effective with it far faster than I was. So the first thing I want to cover is, what does Blender do? So this assumes that you are an iClone user, a character creator user. That's the environment you work in. That's how you produce your videos. And you may be asking yourself, why in the heck would I need to learn Blender? Blender does some things that iClone does, and it does a lot of things that iClone simply will not do. So let's go through them. First is hard surface modeling. iClone does not do this at all. If you want to create a special suitcase or something customized entirely, you're going to have to learn hard surface modeling, and you're not going to do that in iClone. You're going to have to find some other piece of software to do it, whether it's Maya or Unreal or whatever. You need something else to do it. Second is geometry nodes. There are a lot of things that you want to use, sort of a graphics view of things. It doesn't have to look realistic, just needs to look interesting. Geometry nodes is hugely helpful in this regard, and this is another thing you can't do in iClone. Blender also has a feature called Grease Pencil. Grease Pencil allows you to do 2D animation. You can't do this at all in iClone. If you want to do 2D animations or have sections, maybe chapter screens or something like that, and you want to have a 2D animation, you can do that in Blender and then cut those into your final videos. Another thing Blender does really well that iClone does a little bit is sculpting. If you have the talent for it, and I do not, sculpting in Blender is just a tremendous capability. You have to have an artistic eye, you have to have an eye towards sculpting. Once again, I don't. So this is an area that I rarely touch. The next is rigging and animation. This is a whole discipline unto itself. Rigging characters so that you can animate them. Now there's also unrigged animation, where you can take any sort of 3D object and add animations to it using either vertex groups and or shape keys. So there's multiple ways of animating in Blender, and it is possible to take these rigged models and unrigged animations and import them into iClone if that's what you want to do. So that's another area where Blender can really assist you in your iClone creations. The next is shading. So this is an area that iClone again doesn't do. iClone assumes that your shading materials are going to be done and ready for use in iClone. But you can create those materials using Blender. Now there are really 2 variations of these materials. First is shading, which is generally procedural in Blender. iClone doesn't use procedural shaders at all. So what you do is you go through a process called baking. You bake the texture into what is a regular texture. And a regular texture is simply a bunch of images. So you're going to have a color channel, a roughness, a normal channel, a bump map, that sort of thing. I have a video out on that. I'll put a link to that video in the description so you can see how to use Blender to bake procedural materials so that you can create PBR materials for your use in iClone. Similarly, if you're doing texturing, which is the use of those images in Blender, goes hand in hand with UV editing. UV editing maps how those textures are then applied onto a model. So another thing you can do in Blender, create the UV maps, import those into iClone, and off you go. Another thing that Blender does that iClone also does is rendering. DaVinci Resolve, things like that. But what compositing allows you to do is to take the photograph or the video output and further enhance it. You can do color corrections, you can add and enhance glare. You have a tremendous amount of control over what's going to be the final product coming out. Another thing you can do in Blender that you can also do a bit in iClone is scripting. Both of those platforms use Python. Scripting is used to create add-ons. I'm going to touch on add-ons a little bit later on in Blender. But they work very much like the Python scripts do in iClone. It simply helps you to automate and enhance the core tool to do more than what the core tool does on its own. The other thing Blender does that is not present in iClone is simulations. And you can do these simulations and render them out or model them out in Blender and then import them into iClone. So it's another area where Blender can really provide value to your experience in iClone. And simulations come in a lot of different formats. There are rigid body simulations, cloth simulations, water, fire. You can now show things falling, which is usually associated with rigid body. Also in your simulations, you can create force fields. It could be a wind, a vortex, all sorts of other things. So those you can do in Blender, generate the final animations or models and import those into iClone if you wish, or just use them in Blender. Next are video effects. So you can do things like take live motion with your mobile phone. You can go out and take live motion video of a particular area and then add in 3D objects in Blender later. And so, for example, you can take a video of your desktop and put a small animated dragon on there and view it from multiple angles so it looks like it's really there on your desktop. That's not just object tracking, but also motion tracking or camera tracking, because what you're really doing is tracking in the video where your camera is. You can then, of course, animate the objects within that track, and that's going to be your object tracking and so forth. And finally, you can do video editing in Blender. This is an area where iClone really doesn't do video editing. It'll just do the generation. Blender will do video editing, and I have used it for this in the past. I personally prefer to use DaVinci Resolve to edit my final videos. But if you don't have DaVinci Resolve, and DaVinci Resolve comes in a free version also, and you just have Blender, you could use Blender to do that. Now I also want to touch on enhancing Blender through add-ons. I mentioned this earlier with the scripting. Blender comes with a lot of free add-ons by default, and all you have to do is go in and activate them. And they do some tremendous things that really help enhance your experience with Blender and speed up your workflow in Blender. Now, I want to provide a little warning about add-ons at the same time. I have a personal weakness about these things. I'll see these add-ons, they're advertised on places like blendermarket.com. The demo video for the add-on looks great. I say, I want that, and I'll buy it. And when I first started doing this, I would buy it, and I didn't realize that each one of these add-ons comes with its own learning curve. It doesn't just work out of the box. You have to learn how to use the add-on. Now, the learning curve is usually not that big, but it's going to take you a day, maybe 3 days of dedicated effort to really learn how to use that add-on, what I did is I would be easily distracted by these bright, shiny toys, and I would see add-ons on these marketplaces, and I might buy 3 or 4 add-ons at a time. To this day, I have add-ons that I have not mastered. So my recommendation here is buy one add-on at a time. Take a couple days to really learn how to use it. So now that's a real tool in your tool belt with Blender. And then once you've got that down, you can take a look at other add-ons. Now I have some tips for success with Blender based on my personal experience. And the first is that expect to be frustrated at times because of the learning curve with Blender. Learning to use Blender is like learning to use a modern day fighter jet. You don't just get in the cockpit and fly and be successful. There's a tremendous amount of training. It is quite likely you will get frustrated, at least that was my experience. I get frustrated a lot. So when that happens, cut yourself some slack. Walk away for an hour or the rest of the day if needed. Let your brain kind of reset and process what you experienced and come back again. And very often the following day, or even just after an hour's break, go out for a walk. I would come back and I'd be able to figure things out. Expect to spend a lot of time just figuring things out. There are many different ways in Blender to accomplish the exact same result. So how you're going to do it, you're going to learn a lot of different ways, and then you'll be able to pick what works best for you. The other and final tip is watch tutorial videos on YouTube and then perform the steps in those videos yourself. What you're really doing is taking learning from your brain and putting it into learning in your fingertips. And this is very critical. This is when the light really went on for me. I spent a lot of time, probably too much time, watching a wide variety of videos because I was interested in everything about 3D modeling. So I'd watch videos on simulations and hard surface modeling and compositing and things like that. But I wouldn't do the tutorials myself. I would just watch the videos. This is not a recipe for success. Watch the video, take an hour or two, however long it is, and do it yourself. I put a list of the great Blender mentors that I have used over time and use to this day. So look in the description of the video. There are the names of their channels on YouTube, and there are links that you can click on to go directly to them. And this list is by no means exhaustive. But one of the great things about Blender is, yes, it has a big learning curve, but also, yes, it has a huge amount of tutorial resources that you can use to learn Blender and really make it your own. And with that said, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. In the future, I plan on making some videos that show you actually how to use Blender to accomplish things that you're going to want to do in iClone or in Character Creator. So stay tuned for those.